Welcome to this Governance 365 webinar with Rob Campbell on putting the S into ESG. Before I get started, just wanted to share what Governance 365 does. So we're a technology company that help evaluate an organisational governance, essentially a business health check. We then help the board and executive team prioritise key areas to improve, and then we're with them along the way, coaching them in terms of helping to improve that governance over time. One of the areas we look into is ESG, environment, social, governance, and when you look at this subject tends to be dominated by the E, environment, which is very important, but organisations really struggle to know what to meaningfully do on the S. So S being stakeholder relationships, and whether it's your community, whether it's your employees or other key stakeholders. So I've invited Rob Campbell, who's passionate about this area. Rob's a professional director and investor. He's a chancellor at AUT, chairman of Ariake, chairman of New Zealand Rural Land, and advisor for Dave Latelli's BBM charity, which is doing some amazing work. Also the former chairman of Te Whatu Ora New Zealand, Health New Zealand, Sky City and Tourism Holdings. So welcome, Rob. Great to have you on the webinar.
Kia ora, Gerry. Thanks for the opportunity to be here.
Oh, excellent. So starting off, really, many companies, companies we've looked at, ESG tends to be quite low, red on their when we're looking at it, and many companies are starting off in the ESG and they know about the E and the G, but struggle with the S. So what are your thoughts on some of the things organisations should be considering in this area, and where do they start?
Yeah, thanks, Gerry. So it's true, I think, that most significant corporates and some smaller ones are starting to increase their focus on ESG. Mostly in the larger groups, that's driven by requirements by their debt and equity suppliers, and so as, if you like, externally driven, but also it's increasingly viewed as part of a social license or acceptable corporate citizen kind of behaviour. So I think it's a mix of what I would call conviction-based from people that want to do it and compliance-based. And when boards start thinking about it, my experience is that they probably think first about the governance side because it's where they feel most comfortable, just in the nature of who directors are, and probably refer to pretty standard governance matters like those promoted by the Institute of Directors, which are kind of pretty widely accepted. And I would characterise that as playing by the rules stuff. Nothing wrong with playing by the rules, but you can see why directors probably go there first, because most directors are by nature by the rules players. So you don't get many people on boards who are by nature rule breakers. They probably wouldn't have made it or wouldn't last. And you're right that beyond that, boards probably do focus first on the kind of E component, although to be fair to say, most boards in my experience have probably viewed that as a nuisance rather than a joy. I don't think that's too cynical. Not that there's an objection in principle by most boards to adherence, but it typically starts with grumbling about the cost and inconvenience of environmental compliance, really. And it then becomes, I think, something which is driven almost as a marketing component. So E pretty rapidly becomes probably M. In other words, how can we present ourselves to the outside world better in a marketing sense by emphasising what we do? And as you rightly observed in the opening, the S is really the hardest bit that corporates do find pretty hard to get to. And when you think about it, even those corporates which do demonstrably cause significant amounts of harm, and there are plenty of those, don't like to be thought of that way. I can remember very early in my career dealing with an Australian corporate where the guy came, and I'll improve on his language a little bit, but he said, Rob, I might be a bastard, but I don't like to be thought of as a bastard. And he was right on both counts, actually. But so when boards are thinking about this, it often is partly about a feel-good thing. We'll feel better if we do some of these things, but also partly about social license and marketing. Now, we're seeing more in the market now. This is a bit of a ramble, but I'll just conclude on this point and answer that question. We are seeing more corporates now who do see themselves as being for-purpose or social enterprise corporates, where even in their formation, there is a social element, a strong social element in what they do. And I think it's fair to acknowledge that for those corporates, the social bit of ESG isn't just a policy clip-on, but is inherent. And I think it's there that you're probably going to find most of the advances being made. Elsewhere, it's a matter of what a corporate is prepared to sacrifice in order to gain whatever marketing advantage there is in the social aspect. I don't mean that to be cynical. I think it's just realism and one's expectation of where boards have got to so far.
Yeah, and when you think about that, if they are thinking about it as a trade-off, do you think it is the wrong way of looking at it? Because if you think about the S is about stakeholder relationships, and that could be employee engagement, it could be, with your local community in terms of actually, if your staff are helping in the local community, there's something in it for them, there's something in it for the community, something in it for the company. So are we looking at this the wrong way? Is a quick question.
I don't know if it's right or wrong. I mean, corporates are set up to do certain things, and as I say, those that are in increasing numbers are being set up for some social purpose at their core. I mean, that appeals to me, but I don't have any expectation that all corporates will be that way, or that many established corporates can twist themselves into that. I've been thinking quite a bit about this recently. During my more corporate parts of my governance career, I was a big advocate for the turn away from simply shareholder primacy as the main driver for a corporate to stakeholder kind of view of things. But there are some limitations to that too, I've realised. Like most things, you get enthusiastic about and then you apply them and you start to realise it's not necessarily all good, because when corporates turn to and think about their stakeholders and say, well, I'm not just all about the shareholders, what about my stakeholders? Well, the most important stakeholders are often the regulator, the tax collector, the lenders, possibly somewhere down the line, the workers, the suppliers, and the wider community. But when corporates start to think about stakeholder-driven approaches, it is the case that the regulators, the tax collectors, the lenders, etc., get to the front of that queue pretty quickly. So while I'm still an advocate for boards to take a wider stakeholder view, it's really only quite slowly edging in the direction of the interests of, for example, staff and the wider community. I think it will take some time, partly because those sort of parts of our society are not necessarily seen as having a stake. And so where that's got me to is I wonder whether instead of stakeholder management, we're not actually better to be, if we're interested in social progress, we're not actually better to focus on issues like fairness and clarity and transparency rather than substituting these stakeholders for shareholders as our driver.
Yeah, it's an interesting lens on it. So if we think about fairness and transparency, one area is like equity in the workforce. And to think about productivity in general was low in New Zealand, and with high inflation, there's a call in terms of limiting pay rises for staff. And when I think about, when I look at B Corp, which is a big global organization in this ESG space, one of the questions they ask is around um, the multiple of the CEO pay versus the median pay of the worker. And in New Zealand, that's risen from 11 times in 1997 to 2019 was the last I've seen, which is 18 times. But then you look overseas in terms of the strikes in the US, the CEOs of the car companies are 250 times the local, the workers, and they've taken a lot of sacrifices over there. What's your view in terms of that transparency? Should companies be transparent and open about that sort of data and relationship? And B, how do they continue to not widen that gap continuously, which is where it's been going? So if you're on the board, what's your view on that?
Yeah, it's a challenge for boards, because if you look at those top salaries, so boards often see themselves as rather caught in that, because they all want to have their senior executives be good at their job, and they all therefore want to aim at being in the top quartile. I've never sat on a board where we've talked about executive salaries and people said, we should aim to be in the bottom quartile of remuneration for our senior executives. And in fact, I don't recall one that said we should be in the second quartile. Mostly they want to be in the top quartile, or certainly in number three, which is regarded as being quite modest. But if you think about that and then think about how executive salaries are set by survey and benchmarking and all those sort of things, you can see how they escalate. Because if everyone wants to be in the top quartile and you're doing it by benchmarking, well, there's only one direction it can really go, which works very well for personnel consultants and for senior executives. But the boards get rather out of control. It gets out of a board's control in that. And I'm not making excuses for them, but it's been a painful experience. And so I think boards have to start to shake some of that. And interestingly enough, board remuneration to themselves hasn't anything like kept pace with senior executive remuneration either. Now, I'm not crying poor for directors. Don't waste too much empathy there, but it is interesting that boards haven't been necessarily very self-serving about that, but have been caught up in that vortex, and people have got left behind. So the only way to change that is openness. It's why when I talked before about being fair and clear was part of where I think we need to move. And so I've become a stronger and stronger believer in transparency about pay, and it's not just that kind of vertical transparency, which is, I believe, important, because the stretching out is corrosive. But it's also true, I think, horizontally within organisations where, there are, we know, still gender pay gaps. We know there are ethnic pay gaps. The Human Rights Commission work recently has shown that in this country in relation particularly to Pacific and Māori people. There are also some rigidities still in the way we think about jobs. There are some occupational rigidities where the way things always were, that such and such a worker got paid more than such and such a worker, aren't necessarily justifiable anymore if you apply any kind of objective lens to it. So again, that's another area where I think transparency and clarity and fairness can make a big difference in this. And the final point I'd make on it is my perception is in quite recent years, generational attitudes to this are changing as well. There is less acceptance amongst the new generation of staff coming into most organisations as to the maintenance of some of those relativities, even their existing ones, let alone them being stretched out. So I think that with transparency, we will get more challenge, and that I think will be a positive thing, because it's from that. It's not just about unfairness, and it's not just about costs of stuff. It's about trust and motivation and how people feel about themselves and their jobs. Yeah. And that in turn is about power. We're uncomfortable talking about power, but one of the most corrosive things in any organisation is having large numbers of people who feel that they are without power, without influence. Is probably a longer word, but it's the same thing. And I believe it's just as important as the pay differences, not to minimise them, but to draw attention to the fact that too many people in our organisations feel powerless, and that makes them feel disengaged, and that has a negative impact on them and on the organisation. So I think as boards, we need to be thinking about all those things and not reduce it just to pay.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, I know from Gallup that empowerment of people, a lot of people want to empower their people. They don't know how to empower their people, because typically leaders want to lead, which means they have to be in control and have power, and that's you can't do that with empowerment. So
yeah, it's everybody wants to go to heaven, but nobody wants to die. Is the problem?
Yeah, yeah, nice way of putting it. Just going on to well-being in the workforce. So many workers. I heard a story about a consultant who was talking to a board, and it was a transport company, and board were complaining about workers not turning up and various other things. And the consultant pointed out the window into the car park, and he said, "What do you notice in the car park?" And they said, "Well, lots of cars." And he said, "What type of cars are they?" He said, "Well, there's a lot of Priuses." He goes, "Yeah." He goes, "A lot of your workers have second jobs, because of pay." So, it was a bit of a realization for them that there's a lot of companies, their staff are having to work two jobs to pay their way, and there's a risk, obviously, in the organisation around fatigue, and what is the role of the board in that situation on the well-being of the person, when obviously there's some things out of their control in terms of the other. But there's also some things in their control in terms of pay. So what's your view in terms of a board, how they look at a problem like that, and what's their responsibility?
Well, I think, let's say what is at the moment, that boards feel uncomfortable. This is a generalisation, but we're in that field. But I think most boards, most of the time, feel uncomfortable in this area because most of us are of an age and background where these sorts of things were not regarded as the kind of things that you discussed. There was a kind of a view that you should suck it up, and I went through difficult times, and therefore why can't you? I still experience that around the board table. And this is not from bad people, it's just from a generation and a background and an experience which is different to the workforce that we're dealing with today. And so it's a matter, I think, for boards of trying to make yourself open-minded and open-hearted about this. The people that we are getting to work in our organisations now, and this is no doubt going to continue to change, but it's certainly not going back to where it was, despite what some political parties might campaign about in their slogans. We're not going back anywhere. So the expectations of people coming into an organisation now are quite different about what their role will be, about their work-life balance. Their cultural attitudes are different as our population changes. There are generational changes in what people's expectations are of the workplace. And I think boards find it very difficult. Boards end up dealing with the outcome of that. They say, why is the turnover so high? Why are we getting these grievances? Why is our sick leave so high? Why is our domestic leave so high? Because those are the metrics that we see. And I think many of us, and I'm included in this, so it's not a criticism of colleagues, find it quite hard to open our minds enough to what is really happening here, and is the way in which we assume workers should or will behave or think really consistent with the way they do behave, think, and what their expectations are. That's a big shift that we have to make. And we won't be able, in my view, this is a realization I'm increasingly just having, we won't be able to force people back into the kind of model of the way they used to work. And COVID was I'm not sure if the technical term's right, but we still use the term circuit breaker for this, don't we? It did give people a shock. It did give many people a chance to think again about how they wanted to have their work life balance, how they wanted to work, what their expectations were. I'm seeing it a lot in my role as Chancellor at AUT and the kind of expectations you see in students. We're generating now a generation of people who, despite what you might hear on TV, are very well educated, very aware, and aware of themselves and others. They're coming from a variety of different cultures, and they are going to be, I think, more questioning and demanding, and that's a fantastic opportunity for us if we embrace that, if we embrace the way that happens. But if we try and force those people into old structures of working and thinking, then we'll get into real trouble. So that's something I think that boards need to be open to, and it's actually an important governance thing, because we are still forcing on our management very often old ways of thinking, old KPIs, old expectations about not just the outcomes, but about the way they do their jobs, and not seeing that that's actually increasingly hard for them to deliver. So, boards are in a better position really than management often to just think about that more deeply and think about how we might respond to it. I think it's a really important role of the board right now.
Yeah, no, I'd agree. And I saw the piece about Zoom trying to force people back into the office, which is quite ironic in terms of. But it's an interesting one, because people, there's the relationship part that we know in person will build relationships, and sometimes Zoom doesn't do that. It doesn't do that. So it's getting that balance between when you're together and why you're together, and being purposeful, and when you have that flexibility outside of that.
Yeah, that's right, and sort of understanding what the motivations for all that are too. I mean, in many instances, I think that's not necessarily that people will do the best for themselves or the best for the organisation working from home. It's partly that we haven't adapted how we work in the office, how we work within the organisation to respond to it, which has meant that the default of being at home is more attractive than being at work very often. That's not to say it's the right outcome, because at the same time, we have sliced and diced many jobs into so many kind of different kind of roles that everyone's in the gig economy, whether they want to be or not. And that in turn has caused many problems and many stresses, I think, which we haven't adapted the workplace enough to make the workplace the place where people want to be. And that again, I think, is a big challenge for us all.
Yeah, and it probably comes back to your earlier point around empowerment. Is organisations typically have measured people by output metrics, and empowerment is about actually letting them, in some ways, come up with, the ideal is letting them understand the company's strategy and them actually linking their job to the company's strategy. And I think COVID's probably got people trying to look at what people are doing and not allowing them to have power over their own work going forward. So it's an interesting dilemma, I think, in trust, because it is.
And the great challenge is it goes right to one thing I have learned, and I'm very sure of now, is that grafting or clipping these sorts of thoughts, your ESG policies and what you do, grafting them on won't work. What it has to happen is that, and only the board can really do this, is that it has to be integrated with the full business strategy and plans. It's got to be well researched and updated to best current knowledge and practice, rather than just what seems like a good idea. And it does have to actually be understood by staff and involve staff right through their role definition, their job description, their relationships with peers and with managers. All of those things. It means not just that. It means a holistic way of thinking about the business and what its plan is. You can't graft these things on. If you see them grafted on, you can guarantee it's going to fall apart at some time, like a piece of sticky tape on a machine. It might work for the next half hour, but it'll shake off. And I'm experiencing that in just about every organisation I'm in, either advising or governing at the present time, that we're seeing what are sort of immediate responses to try and deal with things fail because there's not been a full reintegration of the way we're thinking about these things.
That's interesting. And linking to that is education of boards around ESG and some of these issues that are present going to continue. What's your approach to how you continue that curiosity and education of a board? Is it something you do as a board, or is it something you're expecting individual directors to do for themselves?
I've got to emphasise, I don't pretend to be good at any of this stuff. I'm just sharing things I'm learning at the moment. So I'm certainly not suggesting I've got prescriptions, but I think the demands on directors here are that directors have to do a lot more work off the ball, if you like. I think to understand this and to get your head around what options might be, directors have to do a lot more reading and observation outside of the business. I think directors equally have to ground themselves in the business a lot more than most of us have been willing to do. That's not to say you become a pest to management, but just being around the business, around suppliers and customers and affected communities, thinking holistically about the business. You won't solve these problems through the board papers. So I think that is part of it that directors have to do, and I don't think many of us are all that good at that, but we have to. I think it also goes to how we run our boards and the nature of the discussions that we have, and this is the area that I struggle with most. I'm kind of painfully aware that our board meeting agendas are not really, and our ways of reaching decisions are not really changing very much, even when we recognise how much our business environment is changing. And I think, for example, adoption of technology at board level is probably less than it is anywhere else in the firm. It's usually, board agendas haven't changed an awful lot. in my experience. When I first started out, I often tell this story, if I can take a minute. The first meeting I went to on the Bank of New Zealand board, we went in the day before to read the board papers, and I found in the board papers minutes of a meeting which seemed to have me at it. And I thought that was very odd. And when I asked about it, I was told, no, that was the minutes of the meeting we were going to have the next day. And the board simply approved those minutes, making such minor changes as appeared to be necessary. True story.
Wow.
It's no wonder the bank got into trouble, is it? Because, in fact, that included approval of loans, which in fact had already happened, although the minutes of the meeting appeared to suggest that you were making that decision. They'd already gone. So we asked what happened if we said no, and we were told, well, you can't do that. The money's already gone. So things have improved a bit from those days, and that was decades ago. But the meeting procedures and the reports that you get, et cetera, have been pretty standardised for quite a long time. And everyone says, well, let's create more time for some strategic discussion. There's a couple of things about that. One is that means not doing some things that you currently do. But secondly, it implies that the kind of directors we appointed are actually competent to do that wider thinking. Yeah. And in many instances, we're not. Again, not a criticism of others, it's a self-criticism. We're often not really designed to have even these sorts of conversations you and I are having now, Gerry. And I know that on many boards I have been on and still am on, people would be quite confused as to why we weren't just, approving the reports from management and checking that the numbers are right and all those sorts of things. It's easier to say than it is to do, is my point.
Yeah. And what would be a circuit breaker for that? So in terms of if you were to, because I've found that with a lot of companies, they do their strategy once a year and then it gets put away, and they then focus on compliance throughout the year. And I think the value, maybe people see strategy as this huge thing, whereas really strategy's asking better questions and challenging your assumptions. So are our assumptions still true? Has anything changed? So it's really what you're saying is it's about taking those insights that you've learned from being in the business, from reading externally, and bringing them back to say, so what? What does this mean? I always use the what, so what now model. What have we learned that we can put in that add value to the business?
Yeah, I mean, we might be drifting a bit from what we started off discussing, but as one delves a bit more into what AI can do, it's very obvious to me that a large part of the compliance function of the board can simply be bypassed by artificial intelligence, indeed by machine learning. Most of it will be much more effectively done by technology than by people overviewing it. We might set the targets, we might talk around some of the objectives of what is being done, but the way in which we have reports and approve them is probably being bypassed by technology now, and we'll find that in the future that the board's role will change. I even wonder whether the idea of a single board won't get bypassed quite quickly, because if technology is capable of doing a more accurate and better job of the compliance functions, particularly if it can delve into the actual data of the business, so you eliminate management lying or disguising or avoiding issues by going directly into the actual numbers. If that gets bypassed, I think we will find that the board we have isn't what we need, and we may need actually a shifting series of board-type functions, governance-type functions, which have the expertise and the attitudinal structures that are needed. So we might have different people, for example, looking at the human side of the business, and others looking at the environmental side, who are genuinely expert, which frankly boards aren't.
Yeah, it's a tough area to get on. That's really good. I've got one question before we finish, and we'll wrap up shortly. Hi, right, this is from Greg Dearsley. Thanks for your presentation. Great to hear your insights. You say boards need to take more account of workers' needs. What are your observations of the governance community and whether they are ready and willing to be more culturally intelligent? And when I use the word culture, I mean in its widest definition, including ethnicity, age, gender, physical and mental abilities, etc.
It's a really good point. I think my observation is that most boards are trying to do this, but where many of us are simply not well placed to do it. And so some of that is you might have to change the board to change the minds. There's a saying, I think it was attributable to Max Planck, the scientist, that science proceeds funeral by funeral. And it might be true sometimes of cultural change.
The other one, the coach said, if you can't change the man, change the man.
Yeah, I think there is an element of that we have to be open to in a rapidly changing environment. But I know boards generally, I think it's a generalisation. I would say the directorate in New Zealand mainly is recognising and trying to change. It's a capability to change that I think is a bigger issue, because I think what that question said is exactly right. And that I think so. We're going to have to change what the board does. We're also going to have to change a lot of the members of boards, because we're simply not well suited to the job, to the demands of the job. I do deal quite a bit with suggestions that we should have better representatives on boards, like we should have like worker representatives, or you've got to have this sort of community represented in that. I am a big believer in diversity, but representatives on boards is often a negative thing, because you get into a kind of bargaining process where people are not thinking holistically about the board. They're thinking about their particular constituency, and that can be quite negative on boards. So I think you have to watch this. What we need is people with much more open and broad minds, not necessarily people who are representing individual constituencies at the board table. That is diversity, but it's a different way of thinking about it.
Yeah, no, it's a great one. Thank you, Rob. That's fantastic. So I think what I've got out of this is some really interesting points. I think the openness and transparency is one that's I think came through from you, and I think it's one that needs to come through more. I see it in lots of organisations. I think obviously the role of AI is a continually changing one. I think the other thing you said, which is really fits, is around the integrating ESG into your strategy, not having it as a standalone or a separate. I see a lot of companies doing it in parallel, whereas what you're saying is that the questions you're asking in the ESG space should come in to your strategy and should form part of your strategy. Otherwise, it's never going to be sustainable. So yeah, I think that was a really great point. And about directors being, actually having to upskill themselves off the ball, in the business, doing their own reading and as things change, so that they can bring more of that diversity of thinking back to the board and have better conversations and on strategy on an ongoing basis. So thank you very much. This really great points. The worker representation, or actually having, as you say, the voice in there, not necessarily siloed voice. It's making sure that when you're bringing in diversity, that it plays into the whole and it's looking holistically, not just at one constituent space. So thank you, Rob. It's been really, really useful and a great conversation with you. Love your work, and if anyone hasn't seen BBM and what they're doing there, it's amazing bit of it's spreading out throughout the whole country now and making a huge social difference. And I think yeah, it will in future. So thank you very much. Appreciate all your insights, and look forward to hearing more about you. Thanks everyone for joining us. As said, the webinar will be available on our website. If anyone wants to find out more about Government 365, we've happy to have a conversation down the track with you. So thanks everyone. Have a great rest of your day. Cheers, Rob.
Thank you.
Yeah.